As of this moment, the world is Sir Keir Starmer's oyster, in that it is perfectly capable of giving him stomachache. The new Prime Minister is in Washington for a Nato summit, his first foray onto the international stage to signal that the UK is still a leading player. Also fast approaching, a meeting with EU leaders, a trip to Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government, the ASEAN Summit in Australia, plus phone calls and bilaterals and meetings in the margins wherever and whenever he gets the chance. I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition of the Sky News Daily, we're looking at the Labour reset of foreign policy and asking what the PM needs to do to get the world on side. In a moment, we will be speaking to one former diplomat about the scale of the task ahead. But let's begin with that trip to NATO. Our political correspondent is Tamara Cohen, and she joins us once again on the podcast. Tamara, the Prime Minister off to Washington, his first big trip. Let's bear in mind he's never actually even been a minister before. What are these occasions like? I mean, from the perspective, of course, of the journalist like yourself, but also of the politician.
So it's going to be quite an experience for Keir Starmer, obviously still quite exhausted from the election campaign. And now already, because it's been in the diary for a long time, heading to Washington for this NATO conference. He'll be getting for the first time on that prime ministerial plane with the GB flag on the tail. And during the plane trip, you at some point as Prime Minister have to walk to the back of this plane where the journalists are all sitting. And then you get those pictures of what we call the huddle, where the Prime Minister looks like he's surrounded by slightly angry-looking reporters holding their dictaphones out. After he's had that kind of onslaught from the journalists, he goes back to his seat where he has briefings from the team with him, which will be people in Number 10, diplomats. He'll have the National Security Advisor, Tim Barrow, with him. He'll be meeting Joe Biden, who he's never met before. They're actually going to have a one-on-one in the Oval Office. He's met some European leaders before. He's met Macron before. He's met Olaf Scholz before, but he's never met Giorgia Meloni, of course, in a very powerful position in Italy now. Kim Darroch, who used to be our man in Washington, did an interview with me a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that, Keir Starmer is going to be the toast of the summit. Everyone's going to want a selfie with him and sidle over to him and say, how did you manage to achieve your staggering election victory? So it should be, quite an interesting trip for him, and the whole idea of being on the world stage is going to get very real. But of course, there's going to be, a lot of questions for the UK about Ukraine, because that's what this summit's about.
For any political leader, but perhaps more so for one who's been in the job for 5 minutes, the messaging and the optics of opportunities such as this really are worth their weight in gold, aren't they? They are signalling to the wider world what our geopolitical ambitions and priorities are. But he's also dealing with, as you've mentioned, these incredibly important world leaders, in inverted commas, on a one-to-one basis.
It's the 75th anniversary annual summit of NATO, and Ukraine is the only subject on the agenda, and Western unity in the face of Russian aggression. And Keir Starmer's first sort of announcement into the trip was that Vladimir Putin cannot win and that Britain's support for Ukraine is cast iron, as he put it. We know already that the military support for Ukraine, which the previous Tory government had announced of 12 billion this year, he is going to honour. On the specifics, Keir Starmer has said he wants to increase defence spending in the UK to 2.5% of GDP, but has not set out a timetable.
And he's setting this out whilst he's demanding that other NATO countries do exactly the same. I mean, I'm just going to gently suggest that might be viewed as somewhat hypocritical.
NATO asks its members to spend 2% of their national income on defence. And actually, this year, 23 out of 32 NATO countries are due to do that. And that's massive, actually, because last year it was only 11 and 10 years ago it was only 3. The UK has been up there among the ones that has been going over 2% for some time. We're currently at 2.3%. But let me tell you what the difference is between 2.3%, where we are now, and 2.5%. We're currently spending about £60 billion on defence. It would mean spending 87 billion. So with a host of sort of military figures saying, I think we need a roadmap, we need a timetable kind of now, Labour are still kind of kicking our commitments into the long grass and saying, oh, we need to do a defence review to work out exactly where we need to spend the money, and that could take a year. So I think it'll be a while before we hear the timetable, but Keir Starmer's trying to just, use the right language, but we haven't got a sense of when it's going to happen yet, and I think that will continue to be getting some criticism.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear why some people are seeing this as a delaying tactic. I mean, is he simply just trying to buy himself time? We all know what the national security priorities for this country are, and indeed we all know where our military is weak currently.
Labour do make some reasonable points that even if you got to 2.5%, it's about where you spend the money, what kind of warfare we're preparing for, whether that means increased troop numbers, for example. And they also make the point, which I'm sure plenty of Conservatives would nod along to, that the Ministry of Defence hasn't always been brilliant at organising the money that it spends.
To put it mildly.
So I think they're saying, well, look, we do need to, give this some consideration before we chuck money at things. The other sort of backdrop to NATO is that countries are under pressure to not just announce commitments for this year, but to announce multi-year commitments, because in everyone's mind is the possibility that Donald Trump wins the US presidential election. Yeah. It's not clear what his commitment to Ukraine might be. So there is pressure on countries to announce settlements going into the future. And Keir Starmer does not want to do that, understandably, because he says that every commitment he makes must be funded, and that will only be funded by economic growth.
So, lots for the Prime Minister to do. Lord Ricketts was a diplomat under both Labour and Conservative governments, performing a variety of roles, from chairing the Joint Intelligence Committee to Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office to National Security Advisor. And Lord Ricketts, who I'm sure will not mind me calling him Peter for the duration of our chat, joins us on the podcast. Peter, do you see any of that supposed hypocrisy that we were just discussing with Tamara there? Asking others to raise their defence spending to 2.5% of GDP whilst not setting a date for the UK to do so?
First of all, I think it's a tremendous opportunity for him within 4 days of being elected to walk into that enormous NATO summit room with Biden and Macron and all the Western leaders as the newly minted political leader with a cracking majority. They would all be looking at him thinking, not just what kind of a politician is he, can I get on with him, but how did he do this? What is his secret? So it gives him a real platform, I think, to make an impact. And yes, he will be plugging the line. I think we all need to be spending more. It only really has bite and authority when he can say that the Labour government is committing to get to 2.5% by a certain time. But the sooner we can get a date X, the more authority his voice will have.
Of course, Ukraine is at the heart of this NATO summit, but from a position of practical politics, what is the benefit to Sir Keir Starmer spending time with his fellow world leaders?
It's a brilliant chance to say hello. Every Prime Minister comes in, I think, thinking, I need to give attention to what people voted for, the domestic issues. They immediately find that the world crowds in, and the fact that Keir Starmer has this opportunity. Then, remember, another major European gathering at Blenheim Palace on the 18th of July for 44 heads of state and government around Europe. I mean, this means that the international dimension of his prime ministership, which is inevitable for a country like the UK, gets into focus very quickly.
You've been inside those rooms, Peter. To what extent does foreign policy and indeed the projection of a nation's ambitions depend on the personal relationships that exist between world leaders?
The personal relationships are not everything, but they do have an effect. I mean, we saw with Boris Johnson, for example, the complete collapse of his relationship with Emmanuel Macron, president of France. Macron just simply didn't appreciate Boris and his style and his humour. I think that Keir Starmer strikes me as a sort of no-drama Starmer. He's not somebody who's going to make big splashes, but I think he will show that he is somebody who is competent, who can be trusted, who will do what he says he's going to do, and who has the great stability at home, which many of those who will be talking to don't have. I think he'll come across as perhaps one could say, a more normal British politician after a run of them who perhaps surprised foreign interlocutors by not being quite what they would expect of a British political leader.
Ever the diplomat, Peter, ever the diplomat. Just on the topic of Ukraine, certainly Sir Keir Starmer, when in opposition, gave no sign that he was even mildly critical of the approach that the government was taking. It was full-throated support for Ukraine. From what we have seen so far, strikes me that Sir Keir Starmer's views on Ukraine in opposition will be pretty much mirrored in his time in government.
No, I agree. I think it's lock, stock, and barrel accepting the approach of the previous government. Defense Secretary John Healey's already been out to Ukraine, already promised them some more weapons. The big issue for the future, then, of course, is how long does this go on? Can we all build up our defense industries in Europe quickly enough to begin to take some more of the strain, particularly if the Americans pull back? So the problems are going to keep coming on Ukraine, but I think he starts from a good place with the credibility that the former Conservative government had by being one of the leaders on Ukraine ever since really 2015, when they saw this coming and began to invest in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like NATO is at something of a crossroads and or perhaps just marking time until we hit November and find out who the next president of the United States will be. And I suppose it just flags up the fact that whoever runs the United States is, of course, the most important person in the world. But whatever United States foreign policy is, it is also incredibly important to countries like the United Kingdom, joined as we are in that special relationship.
I mean, that's very true. But I think the big effort at the NATO summit the next few days will be to show the contrary, that NATO is in this for the long haul, that people are committing as far ahead as they can to supporting Ukraine. All of that trying to mask, frankly, the reality that you described, that, of course, the central figure in the NATO alliance, the US president, is in a very weak position. And the elephant in the room in Washington will, of course, be the possibility of Trump in the White House as of January next year. But I do think that the outgoing Secretary General Stoltenberg is trying to put in places as many as possible of the building blocks for maintaining NATO's support for Ukraine through the transition and hopefully into the Trump years.
But specifically on the UK-US bilateral relationship, I mean, how does Sir Keir Starmer play this, given that the United States is currently in a very, very long election campaign right now?
Yes, I mean, he has his first bilateral meeting with Joe Biden, of course. I think it's the first time they will have met. Of course, Starmer and Trump are not going to be easy bedfellows. In fact, there are some parts of the UK-US relationship, the defense, nuclear, intelligence relationship, which will continue, I think. I mean, pretty much whatever the political weather. But for the rest, I think Trump would lump the UK in with other European countries, and whatever policy he takes towards European countries, they will apply to the UK as well.
But presumably, this Labour administration cannot wait until November and polling day, election day, to discover who the president will be moving forward. I mean, but what are the diplomatic niceties of there being official contact between the UK government reaching out in that fashion to someone who is not, after all, leader of the United States?
Oh, I don't think there are really diplomatic constraints on that. I think it's absolutely accepted that embassies, that ministers deal with oppositions. They have to. I think David Cameron went to see Trump in Mar-a-Lago a few months ago. No, I think that's fine. I think the idea that you are engaging with Republicans, whether Congress or potential administration people, is exactly what an embassy should do, what a foreign secretary should do. It's a bit more tricky if it's the head of government, it's Keir Starmer himself. I don't think there's any prospect of Keir Starmer going to see Donald Trump in the short term.
Peter, let's pause there. When we return, we'll be discussing the 3 priorities identified by Labour in terms of their foreign policy. Back soon. Welcome back. Still with us, the former National Security Advisor, Peter Ricketts. Let's turn our attention then to David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and you have to assume that he's speaking in lockstep with his boss for the time being, at least. His 3 resets in terms of foreign policy: the global south, climate change. We'll deal with those in a second, but I would imagine that the biggest one for the Labour Party, for the Labour government, is Europe, formalising some sort of better working relationship with what we have to say, geographically and, perhaps even politically, our closest allies.
The previous government, bit by bit, were working better with the European Union without really saying so. But they wouldn't have anything like kind of organised cooperation, a summit meeting with the EU or regular meetings at ministerial level. I think the Labour Party will get right over that taboo straight away. So I think that big advance in the amount of discussion, the amount of agreement, I hope, in the foreign and defense policy space, that's going to come soon. I think other things like freeing up the trade relationship, the border issues, that's going to take longer and be, more grinding, detailed negotiation.
Well, the word from inside the Labour camp is that, EU-UK trade negotiations are certainly going to be a priority, but those negotiations, or certainly the bulk of those negotiations, will come after a point where, the United Kingdom has re-established credibility with the EU. I suppose we should say, the fact that Keir Starmer is not Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, or even Boris Johnson doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get everything his own way.
Absolutely not. No. And going to Brussels and having friendly meetings and so on, that all helps, but it doesn't unlock the doors to the issues where there are EU interests at stake. So for any area of trade where the UK says we would like to see that eased up, that freed up, made more easy, there will be a corresponding EU interest in something else. And they will be very much on watch for what they call cherry picking, where the UK comes along and says, well, these 5 things we want to change because they're not working for us. You can be sure there'll be 5 things on their side that they will want to change that may be more difficult for the UK. So then you're back into that negotiation. And we have to recognize as British, I think, that we are not the priority for the EU. So I think the Labour Party, the Labour government need to be realistic about what they can achieve more in the foreign policy and security area, not promising early progress on those more difficult trade issues.
What then of the Foreign Secretary's second and third priorities, climate and indeed the global south? And I suppose you can quite neatly link both of those. I mean, in a sense, is this prioritisation of those two issues just a signal that we perhaps need to play a little bit of catch-up when it comes to those two policy areas?
Earlier on in the Conservative government, the UK was in quite a leading position on climate pledges. We passed a legislation that set net zero targets, for example. But in recent years, the policy to deliver them has tended to be watered down. As we came up to anything which looked like putting up bills for consumers, for example, the government backed away from it. And so there's a bit of a credibility issue there, I think, now. We've promised big targets, but we're not making enough ground towards meeting them. And really, to have credibility internationally on climate, it means money. It means putting in money to the kind of funds that the non-aligned countries, the poorer countries want to help them with their climate transition. Some of it is rebuilding our development aid offer, which the previous government cut very sharply. And without much money in the till, that's not easy for a Labour government to do. But certainly getting out and about around the major capitals, the Brazils, the South Africas, the Indonesias, those kind of countries, I think it'll be vital. And David Lammy, I think, is very well placed to do that.
What then is the opportunity presented to both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary when it comes to this new world order that we are seeing develop right now? You've just alluded to it there. There are regional power blocks emerging. There are multinational organisations of which we are not part. Russia, China have been doing the legwork, frankly, around the world for much, much longer than we have. Just from the point of view of a small island nation, which we are, and we punch above our weight when it comes to influence and the economy and so on. But what can Sir Keir Starmer do now to deal with that kind of twin threat of Russia, China, and the nations that are flocking to their cause?
I mean, first thing I think is to recognize our limitations. As you say, we are not a great power, but Keir Starmer, he has a limited bandwidth. He needs to concentrate on a number of issues. Most of all, he has to deliver what he promises. His word has to be shown to carry weight. And I think rebuilding the confidence and trust in Britain as a serious partner in the world who can bring solutions to some of these problems. We can't deliver everything, but we've got ideas, we've got a good diplomatic service, if I may say so. If we've got ministers who are active and out there helping other countries tackle their problems, all that helps to put Britain back to where it used to be as an influential player in the world, but not claiming to be a world-leading power in every other area.
This is where I'm going to try and push you, Peter, to be slightly less diplomatic than you usually are.
Okay.
The words that you use there are very interesting. Rebuild, putting us back where we were. It is fair to say, isn't it, for a variety of reasons, the United Kingdom's standing in the global community has been diminished over recent years.
Okay, I'll take my diplomatic hat off and I will agree with you. Yes, I mean, I think both the fact of leaving the EU, but even more so the way it was done, the chaos of the politics around leaving the EU, shock people around the world who were used to seeing Britain as hard-headed, pragmatic, sensible people who knew where their interests lay. I mean, I think they kind of lost that sense that the UK seemed to have gone down a dark hole, paid no attention to international affairs for 5 or 6 years, and lost ground in the process. Now, I think we're emerging from that period. There's an opportunity, but I think it is a case of rebuilding. But I think being shown to be a serious country, seriously interested in the problems of the global south, already is a start towards getting back to the kind of position we had before.
It is incredibly important, isn't it, that Sir Keir Starmer gets the right people in those positions where they're talking to the European Commission, they're talking directly to our key G7 partners, talking very closely with our Commonwealth partners, for example. You need to have the right people doing that, because it's not just what we see back here on our screens, it's what they see over there on their screens and face to face.
What they need is political leadership, clear leadership. And if they get that from the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and there is a clear message, there's a policy to carry out, they will loyally and professionally carry it out. So I hope they won't make too many political appointments. They don't need to, perhaps 1 or 2 key ones, but they've got an excellent group of ambassadors just ready to go out and deliver the message once they understand what it is.
Peter, thank you. Just a final word then from Tamara Cohen. Tamara, obviously, earliest of days for this new Labour administration. But if I were to push you, how would you characterise this government's foreign policy strategy?
I think Labour, like many governments come in, aren't coming in with a view to concentrating on foreign policy. Most of Keir Starmer's stated priorities are domestic. I think Keir Starmer has been very keen to obviously show a decisive break with the Corbyn years and say he is absolutely at the centre of Western support for Ukraine, for Western unity in the face of aggression from Vladimir Putin. In terms of specific commitments, while he's been keen to get out those signals, it's not clear exactly how things are going to continue, because of course there's so much instability at the moment. There's the prospect of the Middle East conflict spreading further into Lebanon, for example. And Keir Starmer has made clear he wants to be in lockstep with our allies on all these subjects. But even he couldn't predict exactly how things are going to go.
The world is a mess right now and demanding attention, according to the Prime Minister. Yet, according to Labour's election-winning strategy, so is Britain. Thus, Sir Keir will have to prioritise the nuts and bolts of government, the health service, the economy, potholes and party conferences over the champagne summits with world leaders. But, as John F. Kennedy once said, domestic policy can only defeat us. Foreign policy can kill us. If you want to find out just a bit more about Keir Starmer's plan for defence spending, our political editor Beth Rigby has written her analysis on just that. You can find a link in the episode notes wherever you found this podcast. But that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We're back again tomorrow.